Nobody warned Claire Bennett what would happen when she pulled into her parents' driveway at 9 p.m. with two 200-pound mastiffs. Not the shelter workers, not her best friend Jenna, who laughed so hard she nearly fell off her chair. Not even her own instincts, which had been screaming for 3 solid weeks that this was either the bravest thing she'd ever done or the most spectacularly chaotic. Standing in that doorway, watching her elderly mother get bulldozed off the couch by 2 drooling giants who had never once in their lives heard the word boundary, Claire realized something she hadn't expected. This wasn't a mistake. This was fate, wrapped in fur, slobber, and 400 combined pounds of love that her family didn't know they were missing. But let's go back to where it started, because every story worth telling has a moment, one quiet, unremarkable moment where everything shifts. Claire Bennett was 28 years old, newly single and living in a studio apartment so small that opening the refrigerator door meant sitting on the bed. She had a steady job as a veterinary technician, a tiny balcony she never used, and the kind of silence that follows you from room to room like a shadow you can't shake. She wasn't unhappy exactly, she just felt like something was missing. Every Saturday morning while her coworkers slept in or nursed their coffees, Claire drove to the Greenfield Rescue Center and volunteered. She cleaned kennels, she walked dogs, she sat on cold concrete floors and let anxious animals press their heads into her lap. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't pay, but it filled something in her that she couldn't name. Her parents, Margaret and Robert Bennett, lived 300 miles away in the quiet suburban neighborhood where Claire had grown up. Every Sunday, Margaret called. Every Sunday, the last question was always the same: "When are you coming home?" And every Sunday, Claire had the same answer: "Soon, Mom, soon." She didn't know then how soon that would actually be. It was a Friday afternoon in late October when 2 mastiffs walked through the shelter doors and stopped Claire's heart completely. The female was jet black, her coat catching the fluorescent light like polished obsidian. Her name tag said Nyx. The male was a swirl of caramel and deep honey, broad as a small refrigerator, with a face so wrinkled it looked like he'd spent decades worrying about things that never happened. His name tag said Goliath. Together, they weighed just over 400 pounds. Together, their paws hit the concrete floor like slow, steady thunder. Claire approached Dana, the shelter worker on duty, who sighed before Claire even opened her mouth. "Backyard breeder," Dana said. "Used them for breeding only, kept in cages most of their lives. Owner couldn't rehome them and just dropped them here this morning." Claire knelt down. Nyx immediately pressed her enormous head into Claire's lap with the full gravitational force of a small boulder. Goliath followed, his entire body vibrating with an excitement so pure it was almost painful to witness, this overflow of affection from 2 animals who had every reason in the world to distrust the humans standing in front of them. Claire looked up at Dana. "I want to adopt them, both of them." Dana blinked. "Both? I'm not separating soulmates." Her best friend Jenna called her insane. Jenna probably was right. Claire's salary barely covered her own rent, let alone the weekly food bill for 2 animals that ate like competitive athletes training for something enormous. But 2 days later, Claire walked back into that shelter with a credit card and no plan beyond getting him home. She smiled at Dana's final check-in. "Are you sure you don't want just one?" and said, "I already told you, I don't separate soulmates." For 3 months, life was glorious chaos. Nyx and Goliath transformed Claire's tiny apartment into their personal kingdom within approximately 11 minutes of arrival. Her bed became theirs, her couch became theirs, her entire food budget evaporated like morning fog. But Claire didn't care. She loved them with a ferocity that surprised even herself, walking them every morning as their combined weight pulled her down the sidewalk like a very willing human sled, buying them matching red collars, posting photos that got more attention than anything else she'd ever put online. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in January, her company called her into a conference room. Budget cuts, downsizing, severance package, effective immediately. If you're still watching and haven't subscribed yet, I have to be honest, that stings a little. These stories take everything we have. Hit that subscribe button now. I promise what happens next is worth every second. Claire sat in her car in the parking lot for 22 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, doing the math she already knew the answer to. No job, savings that would last maybe 8 weeks, and 2 mastiffs who consumed their body weight in kibble on what felt like a weekly basis. There was exactly one option: home. Back to her parents, back to the town she'd spent years quietly escaping, back to Margaret and her Sunday phone calls, and Robert and his armchair, and the neighborhood where nothing ever changed. She didn't call ahead. She didn't warn them. She simply packed everything she owned into her car. Clothes in the backseat, Nyx riding shotgun with her chin on Claire's shoulder, Goliath somehow folded into the rear with the luggage, his warm breath filling the entire vehicle, and drove 300 miles through the dark. She pulled into her parents' driveway at 9:17 p.m. on a Saturday. Margaret was in the living room with her knitting. Robert was in his recliner with a novel. The neighborhood was quiet, the way it always was, the way it had been for 20 years. Then the doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door and froze. Claire stood in the porch light, flanked by two creatures that looked, in Margaret's own words later, like something that escaped from a castle in a country I've never heard of. Nyx's tongue was already on the welcome mat. Goliath let out a low, resonant rumble of excitement that traveled through the floorboards and up through Margaret's slippers. Margaret's scream was by any objective measure impressive. Claire and Bennett, what are those? Robert appeared behind her, his novel still open, his eyes going slowly wide. "Are those dogs or small horses?" he said carefully. Claire laughed, already walking past them. Nyx and Goliath trotted inside like they'd been given a key. "Mom, Dad, meet Nyx and Goliath. They're mastiffs, they're very gentle, and they're kind of living here now." Margaret's response, "Absolutely not," delivered at a frequency that made the kitchen window vibrate, was technically the beginning of a war that lasted exactly 17 days. The first week was a full-scale occupation. Margaret refused to acknowledge the dogs, stepping over them with theatrical disgust, narrating their crimes to anyone who would listen. Robert kept a running tally of their food consumption in a small notebook, muttering about financial ruin. Nyx had claimed the living room armchair, Robert's armchair, the one he'd had for 14 years, within 6 hours of arrival, and showed absolutely no remorse. Goliath had located the warmest spot in the entire house, which happened to be directly in front of the fireplace, and positioned his 200-pound frame there like a large decorative rug that occasionally snored. The snoring, it turned out, was loud enough to wake Margaret from a dead sleep 2 rooms away. "That animal," she told Claire over breakfast on day 4, "sounds like a diesel engine with a sinus infection." But here's what nobody tells you about mastiffs. Beneath those enormous frames and wrinkled, ancient-looking faces is a radar for human emotion so precise it borders on unsettling. Nyx and Goliath had been reading Margaret and Robert from the moment they walked through that door, and they were patient. They were so patient. It was a Wednesday evening, 17 days after their arrival, when everything changed. Margaret had settled onto the couch after dinner, her couch, the one she'd been defending with increasingly theatrical protests, with her knitting and her evening program. Goliath lumbered over, assessed the situation, and planted his full 200-pound frame directly beside her with the inevitability of a slow tide. Margaret opened her mouth, Goliath put his enormous wrinkled head in her lap. Margaret closed her mouth. For 45 seconds, she sat completely still, knitting needles frozen in midair, looking down at this giant, ridiculous animal who had driven her to distraction for 17 straight days. Then, very slowly, as if her hand had decided something her brain hadn't fully approved yet, she set down her knitting and scratched him behind the ear. Goliath let out a sound like a very large, very contented engine winding down for the night. Nyx materialized from the hallway, pressed herself against Margaret's other side, and sighed. Robert walked in 5 minutes later to find his wife of 41 years completely sandwiched between 2 enormous dogs, her hand still moving slowly behind Goliath, a look on her face he hadn't seen in a long time. Something soft, something open. "Complete hostile takeover," he said quietly. Margaret didn't even look up. "Hush, Robert, he's finally settled." After that, the resistance dissolved like all genuine resistance eventually does, not with a fight, but with a quiet moment that makes you forget why you were fighting in the first place. Margaret stopped stepping over them and started stepping around them with something closer to affection. Robert, who had been keeping that notebook of food costs, was caught 3 times sneaking them pieces of his dinner, and once, memorably, sharing his armchair with Nyx at 11 o'clock at night, the 2 of them watching television together in companionable silence. The house that had been quiet for 20 years was suddenly full of the sound of paws on hardwood, full of the low rumble of contentment from the corner of the living room, full of Margaret's voice, which had shifted imperceptibly from "absolutely not" to "Goliath, that is my seat. I have been sitting in that spot for 40 years. You have been here for 4 months. Show some respect." A pause, then laughter. Her mother's real laughter, the kind Claire hadn't heard in longer than she wanted to admit. Claire leaned back and looked up at the darkening sky and thought about how you can drive 300 miles in the dark with no plan, no savings, and 400 pounds of dog breathing on your neck and somehow end up exactly where you were supposed to be. Because sometimes the life you didn't plan is the one that fits you perfectly, and sometimes the dogs that nobody warned you about are the ones who bring your family back together. If these two couch-stealing, armchair-claiming, snoring giants made you smile today, drop a comment below. Would you have let them through the door, or would you have been standing right there next to Margaret, blocking the entrance with everything you had?